Hey guys, tonight we drift across time to the sound of ocean waves brushing against wooden hulls. You can almost smell the tar and salt as ropes creak and lanterns sway, their light trembling over parchment maps. The year is somewhere in the 15th century, and you're standing on the deck of a small Portuguese caravel, the kind of ship that looks too fragile to survive the vast unknown. Yet, this tiny vessel carries the ambition of a kingdom that refuses to stay small. Its sailors, faces cracked by wind and faith, steer toward a world no one in Europe truly understands. Somewhere beyond that horizon, gold, spice, and souls await. You might say it's the birth of globalization, or the start of centuries of trouble. You probably won't survive this if you're seasick. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where these late-night voyages take you from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean on the ship's railing, eyes fixed on the endless blue. The early Portuguese explorers, names like Henry the Navigator, Bartolomeu Diaz, and Vasco da Gama, weren't conquerors yet, just men chasing routes around Africa toward India's riches. But the empire that followed would wrap around half the world. Trading posts in Goa and Malacca, sugar plantations in Brazil, forts along the African coast. It was as if Lisbon had threaded a necklace of gold and spice across the globe. At home, Portugal basked in what they called the Age of Discoveries. That sounds noble, doesn't it? Like a bedtime story about brave explorers mapping the unknown. But if you peek closer, discovery often meant finding people who were already there and claiming their land anyway. Historians still argue whether this era was about curiosity or greed, or maybe both blended together like rum and seawater. In the glow of oil lamps back in Lisbon, maps were inked and redrawn daily. Each new voyage added another coastline, another potential fortune. Ships returned not only with gold and pepper, but also with people, enslaved men and women who would toil in faraway colonies. It's a paradox that Portugal, a nation barely the size of Indiana, could imagine itself the steward of half the earth. You picture a young navigator running his fingers along a dusty globe. He stops at a spot marked Guinea, another at Mozambique, a third at Brazil. Each name to him is a promise. Yet for the people living there, those names would soon carry the weight of forced labor, foreign laws, and the strange flag of a distant king. Still, there's no denying the wonder. Imagine standing in Lisbon's harbor at sunrise. Dozens of masts piercing the mist, crews shouting in half a dozen languages, exotic birds squawking in cages, and barrels of spices perfuming the air. The whole city hums like a living machine, its rhythm dictated by the tides. Portugal isn't just a country now. It's an empire of oceans. Of course, even the grandest empires are built on fragile timbers. The Spanish envy the wealth. The Dutch and English lurk, waiting to snatch the sea lanes. Each time Portugal plants a flag somewhere new, someone else schemes to tear it down. By the 17th century, the empire begins to strain under its own weight. Brazil becomes the crown jewel. Africa turns into a supplier of enslaved labor. And Asia, once the main prize, slips away to sharper competitors. There's a quirky footnote most people miss. In 1755, Lisbon was struck by one of the worst earthquakes in European history. The quake flattened churches, sparked fires, and even triggered a tsunami. For many Portuguese, it felt like divine punishment for their colonial sins. "We ruled the seas," one poet lamented, "and the sea came for us." Yet somehow, the empire endures. By the 19th century, Portugal is a fated power, clinging to its African possessions like an old mariner clutching a broken compass. The world has changed. Britain and France dominate Africa. Industrial revolutions thunder across Europe, and Portugal's navy, once the envy of kings, now struggles to stay afloat. Picture a Lisbon bureaucrat in 1884, hunched under candlelight during the Berlin Conference, where European powers carve Africa into neat shapes on paper. He traces a finger along a proposed boundary line through Angola, frowns, and mutters, "Too far inland." The Portuguese claim the map's heart, but the British want their own grand design, a line of colonies stretching from Cape to Cairo. The tension between these two old empires will haunt Africa for decades. Back on the ground, Portuguese officers in Africa embark on pacification campaigns. The phrase sounds clinical, almost gentle, but it meant crushing resistance with rifles and artillery, forcing African kingdoms into submission. Villages were burned, leaders were captured or killed. Still, the resistance never truly vanished. It just went quiet, buried under the ashes until the 20th century stirred it again. By the early 1900s, Portugal is broke, politically unstable, and deeply insecure about its colonial status. Yet the empire is all it has left. Its rulers cling to the idea that overseas territories give Portugal purpose, proof that it still matters on the global stage. The irony? Many Portuguese at home are living in poverty, barely benefiting from the colonies that supposedly enrich them. You can almost feel the national delusion setting in. A schoolchild in Lisbon opens a textbook and reads that Portugal's mission is to bring civilization to lesser races. A teacher points to a map showing the colonies shaded in pink and proudly declares, "These are not colonies, they are parts of Portugal itself." Somewhere in Luanda or Maputo, a man forced to work on a plantation for pennies hears the same claim and laughs bitterly. Even among European powers, Portugal becomes an odd relic, still fighting to keep an empire while others quietly accept the tides of change. They're trying to hold back history with sandbags, one British diplomat sneers. He isn't entirely wrong. If you close your eyes, you can imagine standing on the beach at Benguela, Angola. The ocean glows orange under sunset. Portuguese officers in khaki uniforms sip gin and write reports about native progress. Children splash in the shallows. But beneath that calm surface, something simmers. A generation of Africans educated enough to read those same colonial reports and see the hypocrisy. Historians still argue whether Portugal's longevity as a colonial power was due to stubborn pride or sheer denial. Perhaps it was both. Like a ship refusing to sink, the empire keeps patching its hull even as the water rises inside. The voyage that began with daring sailors in the 15th century now drifts toward a storm no captain can navigate out of. Somewhere in that vast sweep of history, you, the quiet listener, can sense the turning point approaching. Empires are like bedtime stories. They begin with wonder, wander through adventure, and always end in some kind of reckoning. The sails that once promised glory are frayed now, their ropes worn thin. And as night deepens over the Atlantic, the ghosts of that first golden age whisper that every discovery carries a debt. You wake beneath a sky painted with the dull light of a new century. The sails of empire still flutter, but the wind has changed. Once, Portugal's flag flew proudly across oceans. Now, it clings to a handful of faraway lands, like forgotten postcards from a glorious past. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. Names that once meant wealth and prestige have become heavy reminders of decline. The golden age is over, and what remains is the long shadow it casts. You wander through the cobbled streets of Lisbon around 1900, and the contrast is striking. The empire still exists, but the capital feels tired. Once grand buildings crumble at the edges, and sailors shuffle through the docks more from habit than hope. The cafes hum with talk of Paris, of London, places that now outshine Portugal in everything, from industry to ideas. Somewhere, a newsboy shouts headlines about Africa. Trouble in Angola, though most citizens glance away. preferring not to remember that they still rule over millions of Africans they'll never meet. The empire that once made Portugal rich now drains it. Ships returning from Africa carry fewer treasures and more debts. Colonial officials write reports on modernizing the provinces, building roads, ports, telegraph lines. But almost all of it is meant to extract, not uplift. Coffee, cotton, rubber, ivory. They pour into Lisbon like offerings to a god that's already half asleep. Meanwhile, the British Lion prowls nearby. The rivalry that began in the late 1800s hasn't vanished. Britain's dream of connecting its African possessions from the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo clashes with Portugal's claim to the interior of the continent. In 1890, London sends an ultimatum: withdraw Portuguese forces from disputed territories or face war. The Portuguese government, knowing it can't possibly win, backs down. Riots erupt in Lisbon. The monarchy's prestige shatters overnight. Historians still argue whether that humiliation was the real beginning of the end, when Portugal realized deep down that its empire was built more on nostalgia than power. A decade later, the monarchy collapses altogether. The 1910 revolution sweeps away the old order, and the new Portuguese Republic inherits an empire it can barely afford. The politicians in Lisbon argue endlessly about reforms, citizenship laws, economic plans, colonial policies, but nothing really changes. On the ground in Africa, colonial administrators continue their work, collecting taxes, conscripting labor, enforcing the same brutal hierarchies under a new flag. You find yourself standing in Luanda, the capital of Angola, around 1920. The harbor glitters under tropical sunlight, but the mood is tense. European merchants sip coffee in shaded verandas, while local porters carry sacks of cocoa under the watchful eyes of soldiers. The wealth still flows outward, never inward. It's here that Portugal begins what it calls pacification campaigns, a term so deceptively calm it could lull you to sleep. In reality, it means crushing any resistance, however small. Rebellions by African communities are met with heavy artillery, floggings, and mass deportations. Portugal justifies it all as civilization. Officials write glowing reports to Lisbon. The natives are adapting well, but their pens drip with denial. A curious, almost tragic irony unfolds. Portugal, itself a small, relatively poor European country, projects dominance over vast regions far richer in land and resources. The empire becomes a mirror, Lisbon's insecurities reflected across continents. We may be weak in Europe, one politician declares, but we are mighty overseas. The statement earns applause, though everyone knows it's hollow. There's a quirky anecdote from this era. In 1924, a Portuguese expedition reached a remote village in Angola that had never seen Europeans before. The local chief reportedly asked, "If your king rules the world, why do your boots have holes?" A perfect metaphor, really. Imperial grandeur held together by frayed leather. As the 1920s roll into the 1930s, Portugal faces chaos at home. Coups, assassinations, and constant instability leave the country exhausted. Then, in 1932, a quiet, meticulous economics professor named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar rises to power. His plan is simple: discipline, faith, and order. His regime, the Estado Novo, New State, soon becomes one of Europe's longest-lasting dictatorships. Salazar's vision for the empire is both cunning and delusional. He declares that Portugal has no colonies, only overseas provinces. It's a linguistic trick meant to dodge international criticism. In his logic, Angola or Mozambique aren't occupied lands. They're simply distant extensions of Portugal itself. Every African under Portuguese rule, at least on paper, is a Portuguese citizen, though one with no voting rights, no freedom of speech, and no real chance at equality. You picture the propaganda posters plastered across Lisbon. They show smiling African children holding Portuguese flags, slogans proclaiming "One Nation" from Minho to Timor. It looks wholesome, almost charming, until you realize it's all a fantasy. In reality, Salazar's regime thrives on forced labor, strict segregation, and a brutal police network that crushes dissent before it can form. Still, many Portuguese believe the illusion. The colonies become a point of pride again, proof that their small country still matters in a world now dominated by giants. The newspapers praise Salazar's wisdom. The Catholic Church blesses his mission. It's said that he ruled like a schoolmaster, quietly, sternly, convinced that the people, both in Portugal and abroad, were children in need of guidance. But beneath that polished image, the empire's foundations rot. Infrastructure projects in Africa, railways, dams, ports, exist mainly to serve export industries. Local populations see little benefit. Roads lead from mines to harbors, not from villages to schools. Hospitals are scarce, education limited, and racial hierarchies suffocating. Salazar calls it Luso-tropicalism, the belief that Portuguese people are uniquely suited to blend with tropical societies because of their gentle nature. Historians still debate whether he believed this or merely used it as ideological perfume. And yet, for a while, it works. Portugal avoids the fate of Britain or France, who after World War II face growing pressure to decolonize. Salazar digs in. While other European empires grant independence, Portugal doubles down, tightening its grip on Africa just as the rest of the world is letting go. You can almost hear the ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the palace in Lisbon. Each second counts down to a reckoning that everyone senses but no one wants to face. The economy depends on the colonies, the army depends on the illusion of prestige, and the regime depends on both to justify its existence. A Portuguese officer returning from Mozambique in the 1950s once remarked, "We are guarding ghosts." He wasn't wrong. The empire looks alive on paper, but on the ground, nationalist movements are stirring in secret. Africans educated under colonial schools begin reading about Gandhi, Nkrumah, and the Algerian War. They start to form ideas and organizations, small at first, but growing. At night, in villages by the Zambezi River or deep in the forests of Guinea, whispers turn into plans. The old generation still remembers the floggings and taxes. The young want something different. Self-rule, dignity, a future not dictated by Lisbon. And in Lisbon, Salazar sits in his quiet office, penning speeches about eternal unity. The irony is thick enough to taste. You almost want to lean through time and whisper in his ear, "History's tide is coming, Professor." You can't grade your way out of this test. But for now, Portugal still believes in the myth of permanence. The empire endures, at least outwardly. The sun still shines on the overseas provinces. Ships still cross the Atlantic. Children still memorize maps showing Angola and Mozambique as pieces of Portugal itself. And you, lulled by the rhythm of that illusion, can almost believe it too, until you hear the first distant rumble of gunfire echoing from the jungles of Angola. The heat is dry and heavy, and the air tastes faintly of dust and politics. You're somewhere near the end of the 19th century now, and the scramble for Africa has become a full-blown race. Europe's great powers are carving up the continent with the enthusiasm of children dividing a pie, though this pie happens to be full of human lives, rivers, and gold. You glance at a map pinned to a wall in Lisbon. It's absurdly colorful, each nation's colonies shaded like candies in a jar. Portugal's sections, pink and thin, stretch along the western coast in Angola and along the eastern in Mozambique, two distant slices of ambition separated by thousands of miles of wild interior. Portugal's leaders dream of connecting those two territories, forming a great trans-African corridor from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. They call it the Mapa Cor-de-Rosa, the pink map. To Lisbon's imagination, it's poetic. To London, it's intolerable. Britain's own colonial fantasy is to rule a line from Cape to Cairo, a continuous chain of red across the map. And wouldn't you know it, Portugal's pink stands right in the way. Tensions simmer, and then, in 1890, the British government issues an ultimatum: withdraw your troops from the interior or face war. Portugal, still reeling from debt and naval weakness, has no choice. The order is obeyed. Crowds in Lisbon riot, shouting "Death to the English" and "Down with the traitors." Flags burn, monarchs panic. One Portuguese poet laments, "We were promised an empire, we were given humiliation." Historians still argue whether that humiliation killed the monarchy or merely exposed how hollow it had already become. The empire survives the crisis, but it limps. Soldiers in the colonies feel abandoned. Colonial officers grumble about lack of funding, and back in Europe, the young radicals whisper that Portugal's greatness now belongs only to history books. The humiliation becomes a national scar, the kind of collective bruise that festers beneath every patriotic speech. Yet out in Africa, the empire continues its work. Pacification campaigns sweep across the territories. Long, grinding military expeditions meant to force local kingdoms under Portuguese control. The word pacification feels almost soothing, like the hush of a bedtime story, but it hides the crack of rifles, the forced marches, and the villages turned to ashes. In Angola, Portuguese forces clash with the Ovambo and Congo peoples. In Mozambique, they face the powerful Gaza Empire, whose ruler Gungunhana dares to resist. In 1895, after months of brutal fighting, Gungunhana is captured and shipped to Lisbon like a war trophy. The newspapers describe him as the last African emperor. It's a phrase that sells papers and flatters egos, but in the villages he left behind, resistance doesn't die. It goes underground. And then, the strangest thing. While Britain, France, and Germany industrialize at home, Portugal pours money it doesn't have into holding territory it can barely manage. It's like watching someone patch a sinking boat with old parchment. Lisbon's politicians talk about civilizing missions, claiming the empire exists to uplift the African peoples with European culture. But on the ground, the reality is closer to exploitation. Forced labor, rubber quotas, and taxes that turn free farmers into serfs. There's one quirky historical footnote worth smiling at. In 1907, a Portuguese colonial officer proposed introducing ostrich farming in Mozambique as a way to boost exports. The plan failed because no one had considered that ostriches can't stand the humidity of the coast. Even the wildlife seemed to reject Lisbon's grand economic ideas. Meanwhile, the rivalry with Britain morphs into dependence. The two nations share an uneasy friendship now, bound by old treaties and older debts. When World War I erupts, Portugal sides with Britain, hoping to prove its loyalty and earn respect on the world stage again. Portuguese troops even fight in Africa, against German colonies in East Africa and Namibia, and later in the mud of Flanders, where hundreds perish in the chaos of European trench warfare. The empire's soldiers die far from home, fighting for an illusion of prestige that never quite returns. After the war, Portugal's colonies remain, but so does the exhaustion. The 1920s bring economic collapse, coups, and political paralysis. In Lisbon, the parliament can't decide whether the empire is a blessing or a burden. Some dream of modernizing it. Others whisper that perhaps it's time to let go. But letting go means admitting weakness, and that's something no politician can survive. In the colonies, resentment grows quietly. The small educated elite, teachers, clerks, priests, begin to see the contradictions in Lisbon's speeches about civilization. They read newspapers from abroad, hear radio broadcasts from independent nations, and realized that freedom isn't a European privilege, it's a human one. By the 1930s, the tension is almost invisible, but ever-present, like humidity before a storm. Portugal's control looks firm, but cracks have formed. You can feel them when you walk through Luanda's market and see Africans barred from certain cafes, or when a railway worker in Beira mutters that his wages vanish in colonial taxes. Then comes a man named Antonio Salazar, a figure who seems born from the nation's exhaustion. A quiet, calculating economist, more monk than politician, he promises to restore order. Under his steady, cautious hand, the Estado Novo, new state, rises in 1933. For the first time in decades, Lisbon's rulers aren't scrambling, they're planning. Salazar's first priority? Preserve the empire. He knows it's Portugal's last claim to global relevance, but instead of reforming it, he wraps it in ideology. The colonies, he declares, are not colonies at all. They are overseas provinces, extensions of Portugal itself. The phrase sounds harmless, even modern, like a bureaucratic rebranding, but it's the foundation of a dangerous delusion. He introduces the concept of luso-tropicalism, borrowed from the sociologist Gilberto Freire. The idea that Portuguese people, unlike other Europeans, possess a natural ability to mix with tropical cultures, to rule kindly and blend harmoniously. Salazar loves it. It makes his empire sound moral, almost spiritual, a brotherhood rather than an occupation. The irony is thick enough to spread on toast. Reality, of course, disagrees. Across Africa, forced labor continues under the polite label of contract work. People are rounded up to build railroads, plantations, and ports that serve Lisbon's interests. Taxes are paid in sweat, not coins. The infrastructure looks impressive from afar, bridges gleaming, ports bustling, but everything flows one way, outward. Historians still argue whether Salazar truly believed his own propaganda or merely used it as camouflage. Some say he saw the colonies as sacred proof of Portugal's divine mission. Others think he was simply a pragmatic tyrant who understood that empire meant leverage, both political and psychological. Either way, his policies work, at least for a while. The League of Nations and later the United Nations begin pressing European powers to decolonize, but Portugal shrugs. "We have no colonies," Salazar insists, "only provinces." It's linguistic aikido, deflecting criticism with semantics. The world frowns. Lisbon smiles politely and carries on. Meanwhile, in Angola and Mozambique, schools slowly churn out a generation of Africans who can read, write, and think. The government assumes education will make them loyal Portuguese citizens. Instead, it gives them the language to articulate rebellion. They begin writing pamphlets, letters, and songs, seeds of something larger that Lisbon can't yet see. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the tension building across the continent, a hum beneath the surface. Portuguese soldiers patrol the streets by day. Revolutionaries whisper in the dark by night. Both sides sense that history is leaning toward change. Portugal's empire, once born on the sea, now stands like an old fortress on crumbling cliffs. It looks solid, but one strong tide could bring it down. And that tide is about to arrive from the jungles of Angola, the savannas of Mozambique, and the mangroves of Guinea-Bissau. The age of maps and monarchs is ending. The age of insurgents and independence has begun. You open your eyes and the world feels tighter, more regimented, more disciplined. It's the 1930s, and Portugal's authoritarian heartbeat pulses through every cobblestone street of Lisbon. The Estado Novo is in full swing, and you can sense its tone the moment you breathe the air. Calm, controlled, utterly humorless. Even the sea breeze seems to ask permission before touching the city. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Professor Salazar, as many still call him, rules from behind his desk like a schoolmaster who believes he's grading the soul of the nation. He rarely smiles, he never raises his voice, and he hates disorder almost as much as he hates democracy. God, country, family, and work. That's his creed. 4 pillars meant to support the perfect, obedient society. And you, wandering through this version of Portugal, can almost hear the chalk scraping across the blackboard of history. Salazar's Portugal is not an empire of grandeur anymore. It's an empire of control. He tightens the purse strings, balances the budget, bans strikes, censors newspapers, and crushes political parties. Yet he's not a frothing dictator like Hitler or Mussolini. He's quieter, slipperier, someone who convinces you that his chains are actually bracelets of stability. And when it comes to the colonies, he's downright possessive. While other European nations debate trusteeship and self-determination, Salazar simply shakes his head. Our provinces overseas are part of us, he declares, as if geography were a suggestion. He abolishes the term colonies altogether and rewrites the constitution to enshrine this fiction. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, Cape Verde, São Tomé, and Goa aren't dependencies, they're Portugal, period. It's a semantic sleight of hand, but it works. On paper, Portugal suddenly looks vast again, an empire reborn through vocabulary. A Lisbon bureaucrat could point at a map and boast, "See, we stretch from the Minho River to the Indian Ocean." Never mind that the people living in those provinces can't vote, can't protest, and can't escape forced labor without written permission. You walk through Salazar's Lisbon at night. Posters on the walls proclaim "Tudo pela nação," everything for the nation. Radio programs hum with patriotic hymns and calm male voices assuring listeners that Portugal's mission is holy, timeless, and unique. The official ideology, Luso-tropicalism, paints a soft, watercolor fantasy. Portuguese colonizers, unlike the cruel British or cold French, are supposedly warm, Christian, and racially harmonious. The reality, of course, smells of sweat and iron. In Mozambique, black workers are shipped by the thousands to toil in South African mines, often under contracts they never agreed to. In Angola, entire villages are conscripted to harvest coffee for European-owned estates. The wages? A few escudos a month, barely enough to buy salt and rice. Lisbon calls it indigenous labor contribution. The workers call it slavery wearing a necktie. There's a fringe fact historians love to mention. In the 1940s, Portugal published glossy travel brochures boasting of its multiracial paradise in Africa. The photos showed smiling children, white and black, sharing a classroom. What the captions didn't say was that those schools were segregated by law and that Africans had to carry identification passes everywhere they went. Still, Salazar's regime endures because it offers an illusion of peace. Europe explodes into World War II, but Portugal stays neutral, officially. Behind the scenes, Salazar plays both sides. He sells tungsten to the Germans, lets the Allies use the Azores as a base, and counts his profits. The colonies, meanwhile, churn quietly, providing raw materials to whichever empire pays better. After the war, the global order shifts. Empires crumble, the United Nations rises, and the word decolonization becomes fashionable. Britain leaves India, France bleeds out in Indochina and Algeria. Belgium retreats from the Congo in chaos. Yet Portugal clings to its myth like a barnacle on a hull. We have nothing to decolonize, Lisbon insists, smiling with bureaucratic serenity. The hypocrisy would almost be funny if it weren't so heavy. By the 1950s, the Cold War gives everyone new language to justify old sins. The Americans preach freedom, but back dictatorships if they're anti-communist. The Soviets promise liberation, but export control. Salazar fits neatly into this gray zone, a Catholic authoritarian who hates communism, which makes him, conveniently, an acceptable ally to the West. You picture a smoky NATO meeting room in 1955. Generals nod approvingly as Portuguese delegates promise to safeguard Western civilization in Africa. It sounds noble. It really means we're not letting go of Angola. But history is already on the move elsewhere. Across Africa, nationalist movements are sprouting faster than Salazar's censorship can trim them. Ghana gains independence in 1957. The Congo follows in 1960. Algeria fights its way free by 1962. These events ripple through the Portuguese colonies like electric shocks. In Luanda, Bissau, and Maputo, underground networks begin to form. Students, clerks, former soldiers, all dreaming of independence. Salazar doesn't see them yet, or maybe he does but refuses to believe they matter. His focus is on economic modernization, which mostly means extracting more from the colonies to fund Portugal's outdated economy. Highways, railways, and airstrips spring up across Angola and Mozambique, but only where they serve plantations and mines. It's progress with barbed wire around it. Historians still debate whether Salazar's colonial obsession was rooted in ideology or fear. Some say he saw empire as Portugal's moral calling, a divine duty to civilize. Others argue he simply needed the colonies to distract from domestic stagnation. Either way, the cost of denial mounts. Inside the colonies, the resentment thickens. Educated Africans, the so-called assimilados, who speak Portuguese, pay taxes, and follow Catholicism, realize that even they will never be treated as equals. They can rise just high enough to see the ceiling. A Mozambican teacher, for instance, could teach in a village school, but never become a district administrator. In Angola, a black doctor could treat European patients, but never dine with them. You imagine one of those assimilated sitting at his desk, late at night, reading forbidden pamphlets by Nkrumah or Fanon. He sighs, knowing that to even whisper dissent risks arrest by the secret police, PIDE. The very name sounds like something slithering under the bed. Founded in 1945, PIDE becomes Salazar's all-seeing eye, monitoring everyone from university students to plantation workers. Its reach stretches far beyond Lisbon. In the colonies, PIDE agents lurk in cafes, post offices, even churches. Their presence is a constant hum of fear, an uninvited lullaby whispering, "Be careful." A rumor can mean prison. A letter can mean exile. There's a joke among dissidents. Even the wind reports to PIDE. Yet despite the oppression, or perhaps because of it, underground movements grow bolder. In 1956, a handful of exiled activists formed the MPLA in Angola, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. Around the same time, Eduardo Mondlane helps found Frelimo in Mozambique, while Amilcar Cabral launches the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. Each of them starts small, a few members, a typewriter, a dream, but they have something Lisbon doesn't: momentum. By 1960, that momentum is unstoppable. Across the continent, European flags are coming down like old theater curtains. Salazar watches the spectacle with irritation, convinced that Portugal can resist where others failed. His speeches grow more defensive. "We are not colonizers. We are builders of civilization." The phrase becomes a national lullaby, repeated so often it loses meaning. And then, almost inevitably, the fire catches. In February 1961, Angola explodes. It begins with uprisings in the north, attacks on Portuguese farms, and waves of retaliatory violence. Villages burn, plantations are destroyed, and terrified civilians flee in every direction. Salazar calls it a communist plot. The rebels call it the beginning of freedom. You might call it the crack in the dam. The Estado Novo responds the only way it knows how, with soldiers. Planes, paratroopers, commandos, all dispatched to Africa in a rush of patriotic fervor. Lisbon's newspapers print triumphant headlines about restoring order, but beneath the headlines lies something darker. The realization that this war won't be over quickly or cheaply. And for you, listening now in the quiet, that's where the story shifts tone. Because once the first shot echoes in Angola, it won't stop there. The empire Salazar built on silence and semantics is about to meet the one force it can't suppress forever: history's demand for change. You feel the pulse quicken now, the calm facade of Salazar's Portugal cracking beneath the pressure of faraway gunfire. It's 1961, and the illusion of eternal control is breaking apart like old plaster. You can almost hear the sound of it in the air, a sharp pop, as the empire's myth explodes. The spark begins in northern Angola. On February 4th, a small group of militants attack Luanda's prison, hoping to free political detainees. The operation is chaotic, half-mad, and doomed from the start, but it sets the tone. Within weeks, rural uprisings ripple across the countryside. Peasants, many armed only with machetes, rise against plantations and colonial posts. The Portuguese garrisons retaliate with overwhelming force. Machine guns answer spears, and within months, thousands are dead. Salazar calls it terrorism. The rebels call it freedom. Historians still argue over what to call it, but to anyone caught in the crossfire, it feels like the sky itself has turned hostile. Reports leak, barely through layers of censorship, of entire villages wiped out, of mass executions, of refugees pouring into Congo. The regime denies everything, but rumors travel faster than decrees. In Europe, journalists begin whispering the unthinkable, that Portugal's empire, the one it swore would never die, is rotting from within. And yet, back in Lisbon, life seems eerily normal. The trams still rattle through the old streets, the cafes still serve espresso, and the newspapers still print cheerful statistics about harvest yields in Angola. PIDE agents quietly intercept letters from soldiers abroad, burning those that hint at despair. Salazar insists that the war is under control, but you can't suppress the truth forever. Young Portuguese men start returning home, on crutches, in coffins, or simply hollow-eyed. Families whisper about the jungle, about those places where their sons were sent. Officially, they're overseas territories. Unofficially, everyone knows the word that fits better: war. In Angola, three main groups begin to define the struggle. The MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, is Marxist-leaning, urban, and intellectual. The FNLA, National Front for the Liberation of Angola, draws strength from the Bakongo people in the north. And then there's UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, a charismatic chameleon of a man, shifting alliances with the same ease he changes uniforms. At first, they all share one dream: independence. Later, they'll share something else: mutual suspicion. For now, though, the dream burns bright. Guerrilla warfare spreads through the jungles and savannas. Portuguese patrols move nervously through ambush country, their boots sinking into red mud. The empire's generals deploy everything: paratroopers, commandos, artillery, even napalm. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere, melting into the trees by day and striking by night. There's a story Portuguese veterans tell in half whispers, of walking through a village at dusk, seeing nothing but silence, no children, no smoke, no dogs, and realizing too late that the huts are empty because the inhabitants are already waiting in the bush with rifles. "We were fighting ghosts," one soldier said years later, and the ghosts always knew the ground better. Meanwhile, the propaganda machine in Lisbon spins harder than ever. Posters proclaim Portugal is one and indivisible. Newsreels show troops handing out candy to smiling African children. PIDE hunts down suspected collaborators, torturing some, exiling others. But repression breeds resistance, and for every insurgent captured, two more seem to appear. By 1963, the war has spread to Mozambique. There, Eduardo Mondlane's Frelimo, Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, launches attacks from bases in Tanzania. The terrain is vast, lush, and impossible to control. Rivers twist like serpents through the jungle. swallowing roads and convoys alike. Portuguese aircraft strafe suspected camps. Insurgents respond with landmines and sabotage. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC, led by Amilcar Cabral, wages what many historians consider the most effective guerrilla campaign of all. Cabral, an agronomist by training and a poet by instinct, turns farming cooperatives into networks of revolution. His fighters melt into the mangroves, vanishing like whispers. By the late 1960s, they control nearly 2/3 of the countryside. And throughout all of it, Salazar refuses to budge. "We do not retreat," he insists. "We endure." Portugal's army, navy, and air force, barely modernized, now fight 3 simultaneous wars across continents. For a country of 10 million people, it's madness. You can almost picture the strain in Lisbon. Young men drafted year after year. Budgets consumed by defense spending. Foreign debt mounting. Infrastructure at home neglected. The empire is bleeding Portugal dry, one rationed escudo at a time. Yet strangely, daily life continues. People dance the fado in dim bars, mourning without knowing what for. Housewives listen to the radio and hum along to patriotic tunes. Students, those who dare, pass around banned leaflets denouncing colonial fascism. PIDE listens, watches, arrests. Censorship suffocates newspapers. Still, stories leak out, the kind of stories that stick in your throat. A soldier writing home that his platoon burned an entire village to send a message. Another confessing he can't sleep because he keeps hearing the screams of civilians in the forest. There's a dark humor that soldiers cling to. They joke that the army's slogan should be, "Bring your own boots, Portugal can't afford them." In some remote outposts, officers barter supplies from South African traders just to keep their units fed. Speaking of South Africa, Lisbon finds itself some very strange bedfellows. Cut off from much of the Western world's sympathy, Portugal turns to its fellow white minority regimes, apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia. Together, they form a secret pact called the Alcora Exercise, a military alliance to coordinate counterinsurgency operations and intelligence. It's the unholy trinity of colonial holdouts, and beyond them, the Cold War giants loom. The Soviet Union, China, and Cuba funnel weapons, training, and advisors to the African liberation movement. The United States looks the other way, too busy with Vietnam and nervous about alienating NATO ally Portugal. It's a small, grim irony. America preaches freedom while quietly supplying ammunition to a colonial war. You're standing, now, in the middle of that contradiction. The 1960s rage across the world. Youth revolts, civil rights marches, Beatles songs, and moon landings. And yet Portugal is still fighting in the jungle as if it's 1890. Salazar grows older, weaker, but his grip remains iron. His speeches shrink in passion but swell in self-delusion. Portugal is fulfilling its sacred mission, he repeats, even as soldiers return in wooden boxes. He outlaws public mourning for fallen troops to preserve morale. But grief always finds a way. It seeps through music, through whispers, through the faces of mothers who stop setting extra plates at dinner. And all the while, in the jungles of Africa, the fires burn on. By the end of the decade, the casualty numbers are staggering. Tens of thousands of Portuguese troops deployed, thousands killed, countless more wounded or missing. The local death tolls? No one truly knows. Records are incomplete, and Lisbon prefers them that way. One historian later called it the war Portugal refused to admit it was fighting. Another called it the longest funeral in Europe's colonial history. The irony is that many of the soldiers fighting these wars, Portuguese conscripts barely 20 years old, don't even believe in the empire. They just want to go home. In some units, desertion becomes common. Young men flee across the border to France to avoid conscription altogether. The nation's youth are vanishing, not to battlefields alone, but to exile. You lean back for a moment and you can almost hear the faint echo of that absurd balancing act. An empire trying to survive by pretending it's not dying. The Estado Novo has built its identity on 3 pillars: God, discipline, and empire. If the empire collapses, the rest might follow. So, Lisbon doubles down. It sends more men, more money, more denial. But the candle is burning at both ends. And somewhere in the quiet barracks of a Portuguese base in Angola, a young captain, barely older than the soldiers he commands, begins to wonder if this whole thing, this endless, senseless war, is even worth fighting. That captain doesn't know it yet, but his doubt will one day help end the empire his general swore would last forever. You find yourself standing in a small, sweltering office somewhere in Luanda, early 1970s. A ceiling fan turns lazily, clicking every rotation like a metronome for monotony. On the wall hangs a portrait of Salazar, though by now the man himself is long gone, felled not by revolution but by an accident, slipping off a chair in 1968. Fate has a dark sense of humor. The man who ruled with icy control brought down by furniture. His successor, Marcelo Caetano, looks like continuity with a softer voice. He promises reform, a political spring, but the apparatus remains. P-Day still watches, the censors still cut, and the wars in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, rage harder than ever. For the young Portuguese men drafted into service, the word Africa becomes synonymous with exhaustion and fear. You can almost feel it. The weight of heat pressing on your uniform, the buzzing of mosquitoes, the smell of dust mixed with cordite. Each day blurs into patrols through tall grass, never sure if the rustling ahead is the wind or the enemy. Helicopters churn overhead, spitting dust into the lungs of men who haven't slept in weeks. Portugal's military doctrine is counterinsurgency, borrowed from the French in Algeria and the Americans in Vietnam. Paratroopers and commandos conduct search and destroy missions. Villages are relocated into fortified settlements. Defoliants are sprayed over suspected guerrilla zones. Officially, these are hearts and minds operations. Unofficially, they're attempts to drain the sea in which the guerrillas swim. But the jungle is patient. It swallows bases, aircraft, even whole battalions. A platoon might march through the same area a dozen times and never see an enemy, until one morning, a single shot drops their commander and chaos blooms. The local population, beaten and taxed by both sides, learns to survive by silence. You wander through a military outpost in Mozambique. The commander is 25, already looks 40. His desk is stacked with letters home he hasn't sent because he can't find words that make sense. His men play cards, smoke, scratch at mosquito bites. When night falls, they listen to distant drumming from the bush and pretend it's thunder. Some whisper that the land itself doesn't want them here. At the same time, in Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral's PAIGC pushes the limits of guerrilla warfare. Cabral isn't just a soldier, he's a philosopher. He tells his fighters that liberation begins not with bullets, but with dignity. We are fighting to be ourselves, he says. Under his command, the PAIGC turns liberated zones into functioning mini-states with schools, clinics, and agricultural cooperatives. They film their victories and send the footage to Europe, where it shocks audiences who've been told the war barely exists. Lisbon responds with ferocity. Airstrikes pound the forests, and special forces launch cross-border raids into Senegal and Guinea-Conakry. But Cabral's movement only grows. In 1973, as if the story needs one final tragic turn, he is assassinated, shot by disgruntled comrades, possibly with Portuguese help. He dies before seeing independence, but his ideas outlive him. By now, the wars have consumed Portugal's budget. More than 40% of state spending goes to the military. Roads crumble, schools close, and wages stagnate. Families back home dread the draft notices that arrive in crisp envelopes. Some young men flee to France or Switzerland, Others mutilate themselves to avoid service. Those who go write letters describing a war with no front, no glory, no end. One quirky statistic surfaces in army memos. By 1972, Portugal has deployed over 200,000 troops across 3 African fronts. For a country smaller than Pennsylvania, it's absurd. Economists quietly call it the empire deficit. Ministers prefer not to use that phrase. Internationally, Portugal becomes an embarrassment. The United Nations condemns the wars annually. Newly independent African states break diplomatic ties. Even allies grow uneasy. The United States, desperate not to alienate NATO's weakest link, keeps up appearances. But privately, American diplomats call Portugal a museum of colonialism. Inside the country, the dissonance deepens. State television airs patriotic documentaries of civilizing missions, while families watch in silence, knowing someone they love is never coming back. Musicians begin sneaking coded protest into fado songs. Playwrights craft allegories of decay that somehow slip past the censors. The empire, once a source of pride, now feels like a curse everyone's too scared to name. Meanwhile, the secret police tighten their grip. PIDE, now renamed DGS in a half-hearted attempt to sound modern, expands surveillance. Informants multiply. A careless joke in a cafe can mean a midnight knock on the door. Prisons like Caxias and Tarrafal fill with students, journalists, priests, anyone suspected of anti-national thought. Torture becomes routine, though officially it doesn't exist. You can picture one interrogation room, a single light bulb, a typewriter clicking as an officer types confessions already decided. Somewhere behind that wall, a radio plays soft music to muffle the screams. Portugal calls itself the most peaceful nation in Europe. You can almost laugh if it weren't so bleak. And yet, even within the army, perhaps especially there, the doubt grows. Officers returning from Africa begin asking forbidden questions. Why are we here? Why are our friends dying for land that doesn't want us? Why are we fighting wars no one else in the world believes in? These murmurs reach Lisbon. Salazar might have silenced them. Caetano tries to placate them. He offers small reforms, a rebranding of the secret police, limited press freedoms, a hint of dialogue. But it's too little too late. The soldiers have seen too much to be soothed by speeches. Among them emerges a new class of men, the Capitanes de Abril, the captains of April. They're young officers, pragmatic, weary, and increasingly radicalized by futility. Many have studied in military academies where talk of colonial modernity once sounded noble. Now it rings hollow. They meet discreetly in apartments, trading cigarettes and frustration. One of them, Captain Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, later recalls, "We weren't revolutionaries. We were exhausted." Exhaustion can be revolutionary. By 1973, the contrast between Lisbon's official calm and Africa's chaos is surreal. On one side, a dictatorship staging parades for tourists. On the other, endless counterinsurgency campaigns devouring lives. Caetano, increasingly paranoid, trusts no one. Even within the ruling elite, whispers spread that the empire is doomed. And then comes a small but fatal insult. The government reforms military pay scales, promoting new officers over veterans from the colonies. It's a bureaucratic decision, yet it lights the fuse. To the men bleeding in the jungle, it's proof that the regime neither understands nor cares about them. In barracks across Portugal and Africa, resentment congeals into resolve. The officers form a clandestine network, the Armed Forces Movement, or MFA. Their aim is simple: to end the colonial wars and restore dignity to the army. But beneath that, a deeper current flows, the desire to reclaim the soul of the country itself. You can almost see them gathering in smoky rooms, voices low, maps spread across tables. They plan, not chaos, but precision. A coup without bloodshed, a revolution without vengeance. One officer even suggests they choose a signal song, something the public would recognize when it begins. They settle on a gentle love tune banned by state radio, Grândola, Vila Morena. In the jungles of Mozambique, the soldiers keep patrolling, unaware that their comrades back home are plotting the end of the very war they're still fighting. It's a strange moment in history. The empire still firing bullets abroad, while its heart quietly turns against itself. You lean back and realize that this is how most empires end. Not with an invasion, not with a treaty, but with a collective sigh of exhaustion. Portugal's dream of eternal dominion has run out of breath. The Estado Novo's pillars, God, discipline, empire, stand hollow. Echoes of a catechism no one believes in anymore. And somewhere, maybe tonight, a young Portuguese officer folds his uniform neatly, sits on his bunk, and whispers to the dark, "When this is over, maybe we'll finally come home." The night before the storm is always quiet. Lisbon, in April 1974, feels almost sleepy. Streets glimmering with lamplight, trams rattling past shop fronts, church bells marking the late hours. But if you listen carefully, underneath that calm, something stirs. Soldiers are whispering in barracks. Radio operators are waiting for a song. And an old regime, one that's ruled for nearly half a century, is living its final sunset without realizing it. You rewind a bit to understand how the pressure reached this point. By the early 1970s, the wars in Africa have dragged on for more than a decade. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, each front a wound that won't close. More than 1 million Portuguese citizens have served overseas, and nearly all have lost faith in victory. The Estado Novo's propaganda still speaks of duty, honor, and the mission of civilization. But everyone knows what it's really about: survival. Marcelo Caetano, Salazar's successor, is aging, cautious, and afraid of change. The world around him is modernizing. Space landings, television, rock music. But his Portugal remains a museum of discipline and censorship. Universities erupt in protests. Journalists push at the edges of what they can write. Even priests start preaching about justice instead of obedience. And in the army, the young captains can't take it anymore. They've seen the jungles of Angola, the endless patrols, the comrades lost to ambushes and malaria. They've watched villages burn and cities rot while politicians in Lisbon sip coffee under parasols. The army was once the spine of the regime. Now, it's its conscience. By early 1974, the conspirators, the Armed Forces Movement, MFA, finalized their plan. It's not just to end the colonial wars, though that's part of it. It's to end the entire regime that made those wars inevitable. They don't want blood. They want rebirth. They set the date for April 25th. The plan is daring in its simplicity. Occupy key buildings, cut communications, and force the regime to surrender peacefully. Their secret weapon isn't a gun, it's a song. At 12:20 a.m., the first signal goes out over the radio, "E depois do adeus," and after the goodbye, Portugal's entry in the Eurovision Song Contest. To the average listener, it's just sentimental pop. To the conspirators, it's the green light to prepare. Then, at 12:25 a.m., the second song begins. Grândola, Vila Morena, a gentle, forbidden ballad about equality and fraternity, banned by state censors for its subversive lyrics. When it plays, every officer in the movement knows what it means. The revolution is on. You can almost feel the shiver run through the city. Soldiers quietly roll tanks out of barracks. Officers exchange nods in dim corridors. By dawn, armored vehicles surround the radio station, the airport, and the ministries. Lisbon wakes to the sound of boots on cobblestones, but not gunfire. Civilians peer from windows, confused but unafraid. A few approach the soldiers, offering bread, water, even flowers. The soldiers tuck red carnations into their rifle barrels, a spontaneous gesture that becomes the revolution's symbol. No shots, only petals, one journalist later writes. By mid-morning, the MFA controls nearly everything. Government loyalists barricade themselves in the Carmo barracks with Prime Minister Caetano. Outside, thousands of citizens flood the streets, cheering the soldiers, chanting, "O povo unido jamais será vencido." The people united will never be defeated. Caetano surrenders by evening, not to the crowd, but to General Antonio de Spinola, one of the few establishment figures the rebels trust. There's a strange dignity to the moment. No executions, no chaos. The Estado Novo ends not with screams, but with applause. Historians still argue how such a gentle revolution toppled such a hard regime. Some say it was exhaustion, others destiny. Maybe both. Maybe Portugal simply ran out of fear. You stand amid the celebration in Rocio Square. Church bells ring, tanks idle beside flower stalls, and strangers embrace like long-lost kin. The soldiers, young and bewildered, look more like boys who've stumbled into history than conquerors. Someone hands you a carnation, and for a second, you forget that this flower is also a funeral wreath for an empire. Because even as Lisbon dances, the question looms, what now? The colonies are still burning, and independence movements won't wait for bureaucratic niceties. The MFA knows that if they don't end the wars quickly, they'll inherit them. Within weeks, ceasefires are declared. Negotiations begin in Algiers, Lusaka, and Conakry. One by one, Portugal's overseas provinces become independent states. Guinea-Bissau first, then Mozambique, then Angola. Cape Verde, São Tomé, and East Timor follow. But independence, as the world often learns, doesn't mean peace. In Angola, the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA turn their old alliance into a civil war, each backed by different Cold War powers. Soviet weapons pour in. Cuban troops arrive to support the MPLA. South African armor crosses the border to back UNITA. It's no longer Portugal's war, but it's Portugal's legacy. In Mozambique, Frelimo takes power and begins building a socialist state. Then comes Renamo, a rebel movement supported by Rhodesia, and later South Africa. Decades of instability follow. In Guinea-Bissau, the victorious PAIGC struggles with internal purges and coups. You can almost see Lisbon watching from afar, bewildered by the chaos it left behind. The empire it once claimed as a family has turned into a diaspora of grief. At home, the revolution transforms everything. Political prisoners are freed. PIDD's headquarters are stormed by angry crowds. Newspapers publish freely for the first time in generations. Political parties bloom like wildflowers after rain. Communists, socialists, centrists, anarchists, monarchists, all arguing at once. It's messy, but it's alive. The economy, though, reels. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers flee from Africa, arriving with nothing but suitcases and trauma. They're called retornados, the returned. Their stories are tangled with guilt and loss. Some left behind homes they'd built for generations. Others fled violence, caught between sides. They crowd the airports, sleeping on floors, clutching photographs of lives erased overnight. The MFA, unsure what to do next, divides. Some officers push for socialism, others for democracy. Factions emerge. Coups are attempted. Posters of Marx and Christ hang side by side on Lisbon walls. Yet somehow, through confusion and compromise, democracy wins out. By 1976, Portugal holds its first free elections in over 50 years. The Constitution declares the end of colonialism and the beginning of a new republic. Soldiers go back to their barracks. The carnations wilt, but their color lingers in memory. The Carnation Revolution, they call it now. A miracle of restraint in an age of blood. A revolution without mass executions. A transition that traded empire for equality. You might call it Portugal's quiet redemption. And yet, even decades later, the ghosts remain. In Angola, landmines still hide beneath the soil. In Mozambique, veterans from both sides share the same villages, but rarely their stories. In Lisbon, the grandchildren of retornados visit museums and stare at maps shaded pink, wondering what it all meant. You close your eyes and the image returns. The song on the radio, the flowers in the rifles, the crowd breathing freedom for the first time. For a nation that once conquered oceans, it's a smaller, quieter victory, but perhaps the truest one. Because on that April morning in 1974, Portugal didn't just end a dictatorship, it ended its 400-year conversation with empire. And in the silence that followed, for the first time in centuries, it learned how to listen. When the dust finally settles, you find yourself walking through a different Portugal, one without colonies, one without illusions, one suddenly aware of how small and how tired it really is. It's the mid-1970s, and the empire that once circled the globe has collapsed in just over a year. For a country that defined itself for centuries by its reach, the silence that follows feels almost unbearable. Lisbon's harbor tells the story best. Every few weeks, new ships arrive from Africa, packed with retornados, 500,000 of them by 1976. They spill onto the docks in waves of confusion. Farmers from Mozambique, engineers from Angola, shopkeepers from Guinea. Families that had lived overseas for generations now stand shivering in the Atlantic drizzle, clutching whatever they could carry: a suitcase, a photograph, a birdcage, a rug rolled too tightly to ever unroll again. At first, locals welcome them with sympathy. "They're our brothers," the newspapers write. But sympathy curdles quickly into strain. The economy is collapsing, inflation is rampant, and housing is scarce. Schools overflow with refugee children. Unemployment spikes. Overnight, Portugal's population swells by nearly 10%. You can almost picture the scene. A Lisbon apartment crammed with 3 families, their furniture mismatched and piled to the ceiling. On the radio, cheerful announcers talk about democracy and a bright new future. In the kitchen, the mothers trade recipes for canned food, while the fathers stare at nothing. For them, decolonization isn't theory. It's the sound of home being left behind forever. Historians still debate whether Portugal's retreat was chaotic or mercifully swift. Some call it the liberation, others a betrayal. But for the soldiers and settlers who'd spent years fighting under the illusion of unity, it feels more like amputation. Across Africa, the void left behind becomes a vortex. In Angola, the 3 nationalist movements, MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, turn on each other the moment the Portuguese leave. The Cold War moves in like a vulture. The MPLA aligns with the Soviet Union and Cuba, receiving tanks, training, and tens of thousands of Cuban troops. The FNLA and UNITA, meanwhile, are backed by the United States, South Africa, and Zaire. Angola becomes a chessboard for superpowers, and its civil war will rage for decades, long after Portugal itself stops paying attention. Mozambique fares little better. Frelimo declares independence in 1975 and installs a socialist government under Samora Machel. For a brief moment, there's euphoria. Schools open, new flags rise, people dance in the streets. But soon, neighboring Rhodesia and later apartheid South Africa fund a rebel force, RENAMO, to destabilize the country. The result? 16 years of civil war, famine, and millions displaced. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC inherits a nation in ruins. The jungles that hid the revolution are littered with mines. Roads are impassable, hospitals empty. Cabral's dream of an independent, unified Guinea and Cape Verde dissolves in coups and assassinations. From Lisbon, it all seems distant, like static on an old radio. The new government, first led by the MFA, then by civilian coalitions, has too many problems at home. Inflation hits 25%. Strikes paralyze industry. Far left and far right groups battle in the streets. One general quips, "We traded the colonies for chaos." Another replies, "At least this chaos is ours." And yet, amidst the turmoil, something fragile and beautiful takes root: democracy. In 1976, the people vote freely for the first time in 2 generations. Newspapers that once printed propaganda now publish manifestos, satire, and scandal. Censorship collapses overnight. Political prisoners return home. For many Portuguese, freedom feels almost strange, like sunlight after years underground. You can imagine walking through downtown Lisbon in those early democratic years. Posters of Che Guevara fade beside new advertisements for Pepsi. Buskers play folk songs banned under Salazar, and students argue politics in cafes until dawn. The city hums with ideas, contradictions, and caffeine. It's messy, loud, and utterly alive. But the legacy of empire doesn't vanish so easily. Economically, Portugal has to reinvent itself from the ground up. For centuries, it depended on colonial exports: cotton, coffee, minerals, and cheap labor. Now, all of that is gone. Factories close, trade routes vanish, and foreign investment hesitates. By 1977, Portugal is begging for loans from the International Monetary Fund. The irony is painful. The oldest empire in Europe now needs rescuing by others. Socially, too, the transition hurts. The retornados, stranded between 2 identities, struggle to integrate. Many face resentment from locals who see them as privileged colonials returning home only when the adventure ended. Yet in truth, most of them lost everything. They build shantytowns on Lisbon's outskirts, start small businesses, or emigrate again to Brazil, France, Canada. Their children grow up bilingual, rootless, telling stories that start with, "When we lived in Africa." You step into one of those neighborhoods, a jumble of tin roofs and half-finished walls. The smell of grilled sardines mixes with Angolan spices. A radio plays a Cape Verdean morna, soft and sad. For all the hardship, these communities keep pieces of the old world alive. The music, the food, the cadence of Creole Portuguese. Empire survives not in territory, but in taste. Meanwhile, historians begin rewriting Portugal's story. The nation that once saw itself as a benevolent civilizer must confront the record of forced labor, censorship, and repression. Museums change their exhibits. Schools cautiously update textbooks. A generation raised on the myth of overseas provinces now learns about massacres and secret prisons. It's a slow reckoning, but a necessary one. One curious debate emerges in the 1980s. Should Portugal feel pride or guilt for its past? Some argue that colonialism was the product of its time. Others insist that remembering isn't the same as forgiving. The argument plays out in books, television, and dinner tables. Grandfathers defend the order we brought, while grandchildren quote Cabral and Fanon. History becomes a family argument with no easy winner. By the 1990s, the wounds start to scar over. Portugal joins the European Economic Community, today's EU, in 1986, embracing a new kind of empire, this one built on bureaucracy and trade instead of muskets and maps. European funds pour in. Roads, bridges, and universities rise. For the first time in centuries, Portugal looks forward instead of outward. Still, the ghosts of empire hover quietly. Streets named after colonial governors, monuments to explorers, faded murals of caravels, all reminders of a time when Portugal believed the world belonged to it. Some Lisboners walk past them without thought. Others pause, conflicted. A historian once said, "Portugal lost its empire to gain its soul." You might not know if that's true, but you can feel the melancholy of it. The country that conquered oceans has finally learned humility. And yet, even in humility, there's nostalgia. Every June, during the Feast of St. Anthony, old men in Alfama drink wine and sing songs about Angola. They don't sing of conquest, but of sunlight and distance, of something beautiful and terrible they can't quite forget. The empire for them was never just about power. It was a story they told themselves to make poverty sound like destiny. You glance at the Tagus River, where once the caravels departed for India and Brazil. The water is the same gray-blue it's always been, rippling under the bridge. Fishermen cast lines from the quay. Tourists snap photos beside monuments of explorers, staring toward horizons that no longer need discovering. Portugal has become what it once feared most: ordinary. No colonies, no crusades, no illusions. Just a small, stubborn country on Europe's edge, learning that survival can be its own kind of glory. And maybe that's enough. You stand now at the quiet edge of history, where the echo of gunfire has faded, and the empire that once bragged it would last forever has turned into memory. It's the late 1970s and early 1980s, a decade of uneasy recovery. The war is over, the colonies are gone, and yet, Portugal feels like a man waking from a long, feverish dream, not sure who he is without the uniform. The city smells different now. Gone is the metallic tang of censorship and marching boots. Instead, there's the scent of wet cobblestones, cigarettes, and possibility. The cafes hum with debate, students quoting Marx or Milton Friedman, artists painting revolutionary murals, old men muttering that at least under Salazar, the bread was cheaper. It's a country caught between guilt and rebirth. For decades, Portugal's rulers had called the African wars Missões de Civilização, missions of civilization. Now, the veterans who fought those missions return to find themselves unemployed and forgotten. Many try not to talk about Africa at all. When they do, it's in half whispers, memories of heat, mosquitoes, and ambushes that still visit them in dreams. One former soldier, interviewed in 1982, said simply, "We were told we were defending Portugal, but Portugal didn't want us when we came home." That line could serve as an epitaph for an empire. At the same time, something unexpected happens. As Portugal turns inward, its former colonies turn outward. Angolan oil, Mozambican ports, Cape Verdean music, each becomes a bridge back to the old metropole. Refugees and migrants move both ways, creating what scholars later call the Lusophone world. Lisbon's streets fill with the accents of Luanda and Maputo. Creole songs drift from bars in Bairro Alto. Empire dissolves, but connection endures. And yet, for every note of connection, there's a discordant memory. Guinea-Bissau descends into coups. Angola's civil war draws in Cuban troops, South African armor, and CIA money, a miniature Cold War painted on African soil. Mozambique reels from drought and civil conflict, its new independence haunted by the ghosts of the old struggle. From afar, Portugal watches like a parent who knows it has no right to interfere, but still can't look away. Newspapers print images of burned villages and starving children. The public winces, unsure whether to feel sorrow, guilt, or relief. "We gave them freedom," some say defensively. "Yes," others answer, "but we also gave them ruin." By the late 1980s, Portugal is rebuilding itself as a European democracy. It joins the European Economic Community in 1986, trading colonial nostalgia for development grants and trade deals. Highways sprout where donkey paths once lay. Students study abroad. Foreign tourists discover the Algarve's beaches. Slowly, the shadow of empire recedes behind a brighter continental future. Still, the past lingers. The retornados, those who fled Africa, shape Portuguese culture in subtle ways. They open cafes serving Mozambican coffee, Angolan stews, Cape Verdean grog. Their children grow up bicultural, often more comfortable talking about music and soccer than about history. Some change their accents to blend in, others refuse to. In every family photo album, there's a faded picture of Africa. Sunlight, verandas, smiling strangers, and a silence that follows when you ask about it. Historians start digging deeper. They uncover the archives of PIDE, the secret police, with files thick as dictionaries. Inside are confessions, denunciations, letters intercepted from the front lines, whole lives crushed between carbon copies. Portugal must now confront not just its colonial crimes, but its domestic ones. Decades of censorship, torture, and fear. Museums open new exhibits labeled A Guerra Colonial, the Colonial War. The phrase itself is radical. Once it was illegal even to call it that. You walk through one of those exhibits. The walls are lined with black and white photos. Soldiers posing beside helicopters. Villagers standing in burned fields. Soldiers laughing beside signs that read Zona Interdita. Headphones play recordings of propaganda speeches next to rebel songs sung in Kimbundu and Creole. A veteran's voice whispers, "We thought we were bringing order. We were just postponing justice." Portugal's children come on school trips, wide-eyed. Their grandparents' generation fought. Their parents fled. They, at last, can listen without fear. History, at last, is being taught instead of buried. But understanding isn't the same as healing. Even now, the legacy of empire runs through daily life. Portuguese companies invest heavily in Angola's oil sector. Angolan elites buy property in Lisbon. Migrants from Cape Verde and Guinea work in construction and cleaning jobs, sending money home. The empire's geography has inverted. Its old colonies now sustain it in new ways. There's a strange poetic justice in that reversal. The riches Portugal once extracted now flow back, not as tribute, but as exchange. The lines on the old maps may have vanished, but the ties of language, cuisine, and culture endure. The Lusophone world becomes a community of memory, a family scarred, scattered, but still somehow connected. And through it all, one question keeps surfacing. Did Portugal's empire end, or did it simply transform? Historians argue endlessly. Some say 1975 was the clean break, the moment when the sun finally set. Others say the empire lives on in culture, economy, and nostalgia. Perhaps, like all ghosts, it never truly leaves. It just learns to whisper instead of shout. You look again at the monuments by the river, the stone figures of Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan, gazing eternally toward the sea. Tourists pose for photos at their feet, unaware that those marble eyes once watched the world burn. Nearby, a street vendor sells pastel de nata and hums a song that might have come from Cape Verde. Empires fall, but melodies travel farther than maps. For Portugal, the 20th century ends not with conquest, but with introspection. The country that once mapped the world must now map itself, its contradictions, its grief, its longing. The old boast, Portugal is not a small country, fades into something humbler but truer. Portugal endures. You step out onto the same docks where the first caravels once sailed, and the wind smells of salt and diesel. Cargo ships replace galleons now, and their destinations are less exotic. Rotterdam, Hamburg, Boston. But the rhythm of the tide is the same pull and release that has shaped Portugal's story for 6 centuries. Once, this was a place that sent people out into the unknown. Now, it's a place that welcomes them home, and that might be the greatest voyage of all. You wake to the soft hum of Lisbon's morning, a city now more European than imperial, more introspective than proud. The empire is gone, but its fingerprints are everywhere, in the spices that scent the markets, in the Creole phrases woven into everyday Portuguese, in the faces of schoolchildren whose grandparents were born on opposite sides of the ocean. The story hasn't vanished, it's simply changed shape. The 1980s and 1990s bring a strange kind of quiet prosperity. European funds pour in, repaving roads and rebuilding pride. New highways slice through the countryside. New universities sprout, And suddenly, Portugal, the oldest colonial power, is the newest member of Europe's family. Yet beneath the surface, the old questions remain. What did the empire mean? What did it cost? Portugal begins to talk about memory. Not glory, not guilt, just memory. Writers like José Saramago and Antonio Lobo Antunes dig into the national psyche, peeling back the polite layers to reveal the wounds beneath. Their novels are haunted by ghosts of empire, soldiers haunted by jungles, families torn between continents, people learning that forgetting is just another kind of remembering. You find yourself wandering through a small bookstore in Bairro Alto. The shelves overflow with titles that once would have been banned. Memoirs of the Colonial War, diaries of soldiers, poems from exiles. A sign reads, "Para lembrar é preciso existir." To remember, one must exist. That's what Portugal is doing now, existing through remembrance. The wars that ended the empire still ripple through the Lusophone world. Angola's civil war drags on until 2002, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Mozambique's ends earlier, in 1992, but the scars remain visible in the land and the people. Guinea-Bissau's politics stumble between coups. Cape Verde, small and steady, becomes a beacon of stability. Portugal watches all this with a complicated heart. Some citizens speak of brother nations, others of lost opportunities. A few politicians float the idea of a new kind of partnership, economic, cultural, linguistic, what they call the Comunidade dos Países de Língua Portuguesa, CPLP, the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries. It's meant to turn empire into cooperation, to make history something shared instead of owned. In practice, it's messy, but it's something, a beginning rather than an end. You can almost smile at the irony. After centuries of insisting the colonies were part of Portugal, now Portugal seeks to be part of them. Meanwhile, the country itself is changing faster than anyone expected. By the late 1990s, its economy is booming, its cities modernizing, its youth looking outward, not to Africa, but to Europe and America. The ghosts of empire fade further into textbooks and memorials. The old veterans, those who once fought in Angola and Mozambique, are now old men sitting on park benches, arguing quietly about politics and football. If you listen closely, though, you'll still hear the undercurrent of contradiction. A taxi driver might tell you his father died defending Angola, while a waiter from Luanda smiles and replies, "Angola defended itself." They both laugh awkwardly, as if realizing that, in a way, they're both right and both wrong. Historians still argue whether Portugal's colonial legacy was unique. The doctrine of Luso-tropicalism, the idea that the Portuguese were more tolerant, more humane colonizers, remains controversial. Some scholars say it was self-serving mythology. Others claim there was a kernel of truth: intermarriage, cultural blending, linguistic fusion. Perhaps the difference wasn't kindness, but closeness, the intimacy of long entanglement. Portugal didn't just rule, it mingled, absorbed, and was absorbed in turn. That closeness leaves traces that no revolution can erase. In the evenings, Cape Verdean morna fills Lisbon bars. Angolan kuduro thunders through nightclubs. Brazilian telenovelas flicker on living room TVs. The empire's fragments have become Portugal's soundtrack. Still, not everyone feels harmony. Racial inequality remains a quiet fault line. Immigrants from Africa and Brazil often find themselves at the margins, working the hardest jobs, living in the most crowded neighborhoods. Politicians praise multicultural Portugal, but discrimination lingers like a stain that won't wash out. Empire may be gone, but hierarchy leaves deep roots. You take a tram through Alfama, past graffiti that reads, "Sem memoria, não há futuro." Without memory, there is no future. The phrase feels heavier than the paint that made it. Portugal's challenge isn't to bury its colonial past, but to integrate it, to see it not as shame or glory, but as a lesson written in salt and blood. The Cold War ends, the Berlin Wall falls, and suddenly the world stops caring about old colonial lines. The new lines are economic. Portugal shifts from empire builder to tourist destination. British retirees replace plantation overseers. Cruise ships replace galleons. The irony, again, is almost poetic. And yet, through all the change, Portugal retains something quietly admirable: endurance. The same endurance that sent sailors around the world now helps it navigate the uncertainty of globalization. The empire that once conquered by sea has learned to survive by memory. By the early 2000s, documentaries begin airing on television. The Forgotten War, Portugal's Empire, Glory and Decline, the Carnation Generation. For the first time, the nation watches its own story unfold in full color. Veterans speak openly. African leaders are interviewed as equals. Historians debate without fear. The empire's story finally becomes what it always should have been: a shared human narrative instead of a patriotic fable. You pause on the riverfront at Belém, the old gateway to empire. The monument to the discoveries looms above you. Carved figures of explorers facing outward toward eternity. The sun sets behind them, staining the Tagus gold. For a moment, the air feels suspended between centuries, the age of discovery and the age of reflection sharing the same breath. If you listen carefully, you might hear two voices overlapping in the wind. One boasting, "We discovered the world," and another, quieter, replying, "We are still discovering ourselves." It's strange, isn't it, that an empire built on motion, on ships and sails and ceaseless horizons, would only find peace when it finally stopped moving. The Portuguese used to say, "O mar começa e acaba em nós." The sea begins and ends within us. Maybe that's true. The waves that once carried conquest now carry memory, washing the shore clean but never empty. As night falls over Lisbon, you can almost hear the tide whispering the names of distant ports: Luanda, Maputo, Bissau, Goa, Macau, and realize they are no longer echoes of conquest, but of connection. The story that began with empire ends with empathy. And maybe, after 6 centuries of chasing the horizon, Portugal has finally come home. You stand once more on the banks of the Tagus, but this time the wind carries not the scent of empire, but the calm breath of reconciliation. The ships that glide across the water are freighters and ferries, not caravels. Their sails are gone, replaced by cranes and steel hulls. Portugal's empire has vanished into memory, yet memory itself has become a kind of second empire, one built not on conquest, but on conversation. By the mid-2000s, the national mood has shifted. Younger generations, born long after the wars, begin to view the colonial period with curiosity rather than pride. To them, Africa isn't a lost possession, but a shared history, a mosaic of languages, families, and rhythms that still beat within Portuguese culture. You can see it everywhere, in the food, the music, the words that slip unconsciously into speech. Lisbon becomes a crossroads again, though this time not of explorers, but of migrants. Neighborhoods like Amadora, Cova da Moura, and Chelis fill with Cape Verdeans, Angolans, and Guineans seeking work and education. Markets smell of cassava and grilled fish. Churches echo with Kimbundu hymns. Soccer games mix accents from 3 continents. The empire that once spanned oceans has returned home in human form. Some Lisboners welcome this new diversity. Others grumble that the country has changed too fast. In a small cafe near Martim Moniz, an old man points at the bustling square and mutters, "We brought civilization there. Now they bring life back here." He says it half with pride, half with confusion. The roles have reversed, and he's not sure how to feel about it. Historians call this reversal the post-imperial mirror. Every former colonial power faces it. The realization that the people once ruled from afar are now neighbors, colleagues, even family. For Portugal, it's both unsettling and beautiful, a full circle moment that forces the nation to finally see its reflection clearly. But reflection doesn't mean harmony. Racism, though quieter than before, still stalks the edges of society. Afro-Portuguese citizens speak of being Portuguese but never fully seen as such. Debates erupt over statues, street names, and school curricula. Should heroes like Vasco da Gama still stand tall in stone? Or should their plinths tell fuller stories of conquest and cruelty alongside courage? The conversations grow louder after 2015, when waves of activism sweep Europe and the Americas. In Lisbon, protesters place red paint on colonial monuments, demanding acknowledgement of slavery and exploitation. Others argue that erasure helps no one, that Portugal must remember, not delete, its past. The air buzzes with disagreement, but also with honesty. After centuries of denial, the country is finally arguing out loud. You walk through the city's museums, where new exhibits attempt balance. At the Museum of the Orient, curators showcase both Portuguese navigation and the Asian voices once silenced by it. The National Museum of African Art holds panels titled "Shared Seas, Divided Shores." One installation simply shows a rotating globe projected onto water, dissolving continents into ripples. A plaque reads, "All empires end in reflection." Meanwhile, in Angola and Mozambique, the connections deepen again, this time through trade and culture. Portuguese construction firms rebuild Luanda's skyline. Angolan investors buy real estate in Lisbon's Chiado district. Television networks broadcast Angolan soap operas to Portuguese audiences, while Lisbon rappers mix Creole slang with Lisbon street talk. The flow of influence has reversed completely. Africa exports its culture northward, and Portugal learns to dance to its own echoes. But the old wounds remain raw for some. Veterans associations still hold quiet memorials each April for those who died in the colonial wars. They gather in parks, gray-haired now, their medals polished but meaningless. Some feel forgotten, others relieved. When asked what they fought for, one veteran says, "For lies perhaps, but we were too young to know." The state begins offering limited recognition, pensions, plaques, documentaries. But the deeper reconciliation is social, not official. The true healing happens in conversations. A grandson asking his grandfather what it was really like. A history teacher inviting a student's Angolan mother to speak to the class. A song written by a Cape Verdean musician titled "We All Came by Sea." By the 2000s, scholars re-evaluate the entire narrative of discovery. They point out that Africa and Asia had their own civilizations, maps, and trade routes long before the Portuguese arrived. "We did not discover," one historian writes, "we encountered." That single word, encounter, changes everything. It turns a story of domination into one of collision, of two sides meeting, sometimes violently, sometimes beautifully. Lisbon itself begins to mirror that idea. Once a city of departure, it becomes a city of return. Immigrants open Angolan barbecue joints beside pastelarias. Buskers play Cape Verdean morna on electric guitars. Murals of African queens appear beside the faces of explorers. The old imperial capital hums like a jazz tune, structured by history but improvised by the present. You pass through Praça do Comércio, where caravels once set sail. Tourists pose for selfies beneath the triumphal arch, unaware that this plaza once witnessed slave auctions. The irony isn't lost on locals. A space built for empire, now filled with travelers from every corner of the former empire, eating ice cream together in the sun. Portugal has entered what some call the Empire of Memory. It no longer commands territory, but it governs a vast emotional geography, a world connected by language, cuisine, and shared melancholy. The Portuguese word for that feeling is saudade, a longing that's both sweet and sad, a love for something that can never return. It's the perfect word for a country that lost the world and found itself. Historians still debate whether Portugal handled decolonization better or worse than its European peers. France had Algeria, Britain had India and Kenya, Belgium had the Congo. All ended badly. Portugal's wars were longer, its revolution bloodless but chaotic, its legacy complex. But perhaps what makes it distinct is how completely it changed afterward, from dictatorship to democracy, from empire to equality. Few nations have turned themselves inside out so completely in so short a time. You stand once more by the Tagus as night falls. Cargo ships glide past the bridge, their lights tracing constellations across the water. Somewhere across that horizon lies Angola. Beyond that, Mozambique. Farther still, Brazil. Each a chapter in the same sprawling story. The sea that once carried conquest now carries commerce, ideas, migration, hope. A fisherman beside you tosses his line into the dark and says, softly, "The sea gives and takes, always." He's right. It gave Portugal an empire, then took it back, and in doing so, returned something more precious: perspective. For centuries, Portugal sought to map the world. Now, it learns to live within it. The empire is gone, but the sea still begins and ends within them all. The world of the 21st century doesn't need maps drawn by kings. It needs empathy, drawn by memory. And so Portugal, small, quiet, steady, keeps rereading itself like a long novel whose ending no one quite remembers. You can almost feel that mood in Lisbon's air today, the mix of melancholy and motion, of old stones and new voices. By the 2000s, a new generation has taken the stage, children and grandchildren of those who fought, fled, or returned from Africa. They carry none of the guilt of empire, but all of its echoes. Their Portuguese sounds different, stretched by Creole cadences. Their playlists jump from fado to Angolan kizomba to Brazilian funk. For them, lusophone isn't politics, it's rhythm. Still, history lingers like salt in the soil. The colonial wars remain the longest and most censored conflict in Portugal's modern memory. Veterans gather online, sharing black and white photos of outposts swallowed by jungle. In universities, scholars publish testimonies that were once whispered. One famous historian writes, "The silence lasted longer than the war itself." He isn't wrong. For decades, Portugal treated those wars as bad dreams, half remembered and half denied. But now, the dreams speak back. Documentaries show the faces of African fighters once labeled terrorists. Portuguese audiences see, many for the first time, that the men who shot at their grandfathers were often farmers defending their own land. It's uncomfortable, but also freeing. The story finally gains all its voices. You stroll through the Alfama Quarter and hear young street performers remixing old revolutionary songs. The refrain of Grindola Vila Morena, that lullaby of the Carnation Revolution, floats above the cobbles, woven with drums and electric bass. The lyrics about fraternity and equality still fit. They've simply found a new beat. Meanwhile, Portugal's relationship with its former colonies deepens again through migration, trade, and art. Angolan oil companies own stakes in Portuguese banks. Cape Verdean airlines connect Lisbon to the Atlantic islands daily. Mozambican artists exhibit in European galleries. The line between former colonizer and former colony grows blurrier by the year. There's a lovely, quiet irony in that. An empire once obsessed with boundaries has become a network of crossings. The Atlantic, once a moat of conquest, is now a mirror. Inside classrooms, the textbooks finally change tone. Where once the Age of Discoveries was celebrated as heroic adventure, It's now taught as a global turning point, brilliance and brutality side by side. Teachers ask students to imagine not only the sailor setting sail, but also the people watching the strange ships arrive. The exercise doesn't erase pride, it adds perspective. Some parents grumble that we're teaching our children to be ashamed, but others understand it isn't shame, it's maturity. Pride without truth is just nostalgia. Museums continue the slow work of truth-telling. The city of Porto plans a memorial to honor victims of slavery, acknowledging Portugal's role in the Atlantic slave trade, a history once politely sidestepped. Lisbon's new Museum of the Discoveries debates renaming itself entirely to reflect not only discovery but encounter, exchange, and exploitation. The conversation grows heated, but that's how nations evolve, through argument, not silence. And somewhere beyond politics, the arts take the lead. Portuguese filmmakers explore colonial memory through surreal images. A soldier wandering endless dunes, a ship sailing backward toward the coast it once conquered. Writers weave stories of migration, belonging, and saudade, that untranslatable ache for what's gone but never forgotten. You leaf through one of those novels on a tram, a tale of a woman born in Luanda who returns to Lisbon after the revolution, searching for the house her parents once owned. She finds it turned into apartments, strangers living in every room. The walls remember, she says, even if we pretend not to. You look up from the page and realize she could be speaking for the whole country. And then, quietly, Portugal steps into a new century's rhythm. It's not an empire anymore, but a hub of language and culture spanning 4 continents. In Lisbon cafes, Angolan business people hold meetings with Brazilian designers. Cape Verdean singers headline European festivals. Students from Mozambique study architecture under Erasmus grants. The old imperial network has become a web of cooperation. Uneven, yes, but alive. Still, there's always that undertow of saudade. Every April 25th, the nation celebrates Freedom Day, the anniversary of the Carnation Revolution. Veterans march, musicians play, and the streets bloom with red flowers again. Older citizens cry softly. The young dance. The anthem of liberty blends with the rhythm of hip-hop. It's remembrance as renewal. On those days, you can almost sense Salazar's ghost, bewildered, irrelevant, watching a Portugal he would never recognize. Democratic, diverse, loud, joyful. Maybe that's the best revenge history ever delivers. Of course, not all is harmony. Economic crises hit, populism stirs, and the temptation of forgetting returns. When times are hard, some politicians wave the flag of nostalgia, promising national pride without nuance. But Portugal's people, seasoned by centuries of tides, have learned caution. They know pride must be tethered to truth or it drifts into delusion. One evening, you walk past the statue of Prince Henry the Navigator. Someone has placed a small sign at its base. We are all explorers, but not all journeys conquer. The city leaves it there. That's the difference between the old empire and the new Portugal. The old silenced what hurt. The new allows conversation to bloom, even when it stings. You pause at the river again, the eternal witness. Cargo cranes flash red lights in the dusk. Gulls wheel overhead. The water laps against the quay where sailors once prayed before setting off for Africa or India. The same river that launched conquest now reflects the lights of a democratic city, alive and imperfect. Perhaps that's the truest moral of Portugal's long, restless story. That endurance matters more than dominance, that identity isn't found in flags or borders, but in how a people face their own reflection. Empires end. Empathy lasts. And as the night wind moves across the Tagus, you could swear you hear it whisper, "At last, we have come home." By the 2020s, the empire lives on only in stories. Those told in classrooms, those whispered by grandparents, those filmed for documentaries or sung softly over guitar strings. You, standing in the present, can see how every thread of Portugal's long colonial past has woven itself into the modern fabric of the nation. The pattern is uneven, some threads bright with pride, others dark with pain, but together they form something honest, a tapestry of survival. Lisbon itself has changed beyond recognition. The neighborhoods that once echoed with the whispers of empire now hum with the languages of its descendants. At the Mercado da Ribeira, you can buy Angolan muamba de galinha beside Portuguese bacalhau à brás. On the tram, you'll hear passengers switching seamlessly between Portuguese, Creole, and Brazilian slang. The city once built on the wealth of faraway lands now thrives on the diversity of the people who came from them. But even as Portugal moves forward, the empire refuses to rest entirely. Memory has a stubborn rhythm. It resurfaces in anniversaries, headlines, and debates. The country still struggles to define what remembering means. Some say the time for guilt has passed. Others argue that wounds unacknowledged never truly close. One rainy afternoon, you step into the Museu do Aljube, a museum dedicated to resistance and freedom. Inside are the preserved prison cells where PIDE once held political prisoners, their graffiti still etched into the walls. Liberdade, one scrawl reads, freedom. Another, almost childlike, says, maybe tomorrow. The air inside feels heavy, as if the building itself exhales history. Standing there, you realize how tightly Portugal's colonial story is bound to its own dictatorship. Two halves of the same long silence. Historians have begun connecting those dots. They argue that the Estado Novo's control at home and its grip overseas were reflections of each other, both built on hierarchy, fear, and denial. When the colonies fell, the dictatorship fell with them. It wasn't a coincidence, it was cause and effect. Portugal could not decolonize abroad until it decolonized its own mind. It's a strange truth. The end of empire liberated not only the colonized, but also the colonizer. Yet, that liberation came with its own shadows. The Retornados generation, now elderly, still carries the ache of loss. Many never felt truly accepted upon their return. We lost Africa twice, one woman tells a journalist, once when we left, and again when no one wanted to hear our stories. But their children, born in Lisbon or Porto, are the bridge, fluent in both nostalgia and renewal. They write novels, start businesses, and quietly ensure that their parents' displacement becomes part of the national memory rather than a footnote. In recent years, filmmakers and artists have turned their gaze toward that silence. Award-winning documentaries revisit the colonial wars with empathy for all sides. Musicians remix protest songs from 1974 into electronic anthems. Street artists paint murals of both Portuguese soldiers and African revolutionaries, their faces meeting eye to eye across concrete walls. The message is clear. It's time to remember together. Still, some resist this reckoning. You can sense the tension whenever a new debate erupts over a statue or a curriculum change. One side fears erasure, the other demands acknowledgement. The argument has no clean resolution because history itself never does. But maybe that's progress, not a neat conclusion, but a willingness to keep talking. On warm evenings, Lisbon's waterfront fills with young couples, musicians, and food stalls. The monument to the discoveries glows under floodlights, and for a moment, it almost looks alive again. Sails carved in stone, explorers frozen mid-step. But now, people approach it differently. They take photos not in reverence, but in reflection. Some touch the marble and whisper about what it means to discover a world already inhabited. The monument hasn't changed, but the eyes that look upon it have. Across the Atlantic, in Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde, The relationship with Portugal evolves too. It's no longer defined by domination or resentment, but by complex intimacy. Lusophone summits bring together presidents, writers, and musicians. Joint cultural festivals celebrate shared language and art. Young Africans come to Lisbon for university. Young Portuguese fly to Luanda for opportunity. The current flows both ways. That's the quiet redemption of history. The empire that once enslaved now exchanges, teaches, learns. The arrogance that once justified conquest has given way to curiosity. The sea that separated now connects. And yet, there's always that whisper of saudade. In the cafes of Alfama, older men still speak fondly of Mozambique's sunsets, Angola's red earth, the smell of rain in Guinea. They're not yearning for empire, they're yearning for youth, for moments when the world felt infinite. You can't blame them for that. Every nation mourns its own mythology before learning how to live without it. In schools, children learn that the Portuguese Empire lasted nearly 6 centuries, longer than any other in Europe. But their teachers remind them that longevity isn't virtue. They study not just the voyages of Vasco da Gama, but also the resistance of Queen Njinga of Angola, the strikes of Mozambican miners, the letters of Amilcar Cabral. In those stories, Portugal finally meets the mirror it spent centuries avoiding. And what does that reflection show? A small country that dreamed big, sinned deeply, and learned slowly. A people who crossed oceans to seek glory and came back to find grace. You sit by the river one last time, watching the sunset turn the water to bronze. The bridge arches overhead like a promise, connecting not just 2 sides of the city, but 2 halves of history. Somewhere behind you, church bells ring. Somewhere far away, the Atlantic beats against another shore once marked Portuguese. The waves sound the same everywhere. They always have. You take a slow breath, feeling the pulse of centuries settle into the evening calm. Empires rise, empires fall, and what remains is not gold or maps or monuments, but the quiet courage to remember. Because memory, like the sea, never truly ends. It just returns in different tides. The waves you hear now are softer, gentle reminders rather than roaring tides. The story of Portugal's empire has nearly run its course, and you can feel it reaching that delicate point where history fades into reflection. What remains are not borders or armies, but stories told across dinner tables, in classrooms, and on the wind that still smells faintly of salt and cinnamon. By the 2020s, the work of remembrance has become as much about empathy as about facts. You see it in the faces of the young, descendants of colonizers and colonized sitting side by side in lecture halls, discussing what it means to belong to a shared language that once divided them. For them, Portuguese isn't the tongue of empire. It's the voice of music, of film, of laughter that crosses oceans. In Lisbon's universities, professors teach global Lusophone studies, where students trace connections between Goa, Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and Timor-Leste. The focus is no longer who ruled whom, but what remains when the ruling stops. The words, the rhythms, the hybrid cultures that grew from centuries of contact and contradiction. It's a kind of academic healing, understanding through context rather than denial. One of those students might be a young Angolan woman who's never seen war but carries its echo in her family's stories. Her Portuguese classmate listens, realizing for the first time that his country's golden age was built on other people's darkness. Neither blames the other. They simply share a silence between them, a silence filled with understanding. In the arts too, Portugal begins to reinterpret itself. Filmmakers like Pedro Costa and João Pedro Rodrigues use light and shadow to capture the uneasy beauty of post-imperial life. Their characters wander Lisbon's decaying neighborhoods, haunted by memory, searching for identity in the ruins of grandeur. Critics call it cinema of absence. You might call it honesty. Musicians bridge the past and present in gentler ways. Cape Verdean singers blend morno with fado, creating songs that sound like both mourning and forgiveness. Angolan rappers in Lisbon rhyme about racism and rebirth, about belonging to a country that once claimed theirs. Even Portugal's most traditional ballads now echo with African rhythms, as if the nation's heart finally learned to beat in sync with its history. And through it all, saudade remains, the nation's emotional compass. That peculiar blend of longing and acceptance becomes Portugal's greatest export, understood in every corner of the Lusophone world. It's there in Brazilian bossa nova, in Cape Verde's Coladeira, in the poetry of Mozambique's Mia Couto. Each version carries the same pulse. We remember, therefore we endure. Historians continue to peel back the layers. New books challenge old myths, revealing the brutal logistics behind empire. Forced labor, racial hierarchy, the prophets that built palaces. But rather than deny them, Portugal begins to weave them into its national consciousness. The story becomes more complete, less flattering, more human. At the same time, global audiences rediscover Portugal's role in shaping modernity itself. It was Portuguese ships that linked continents, Portuguese maps that first circled the globe. Yet every innovation had its shadow, every discovery a cost. To map the world, one historian writes, is also to carve it. That duality defines Portugal's legacy: exploration and exploitation, courage and cruelty, always entwined. You pass a classroom where children are learning about the Carnation Revolution. Their teacher explains that the soldiers didn't fire their weapons, that the people placed flowers in their rifles instead. A small boy raises his hand and asks, "Why did they have guns if they only needed flowers?" The teacher smiles sadly. "Because," she says, "sometimes you must show power to choose peace." Outside, the city hums with that same quiet resilience. Street vendors sell roasted chestnuts beside sleek tech offices. Old trams rumble past murals of Queen Jinga and Amilcar Cabral painted in vibrant colors. The city no longer hides from its ghosts, it commissions them. And then, far away in Angola, a new generation grows up speaking Portuguese with pride, reading poets from both Lisbon and Luanda. Mozambique celebrates its Independence Day with fireworks and songs from both African drums and Portuguese guitars. The scars remain, but they are no longer open wounds. They've become part of the landscape, visible, instructive, and strangely beautiful. The global Lusophone community now spans 4 continents, a web of shared language stronger than any empire could ever enforce. Portugal, once a small nation that thought itself enormous, now understands that influence doesn't come from domination, but from connection. Trade, art, and empathy have replaced ships, armies, and flags. You look again toward the sea, the same horizon that once carried dreams of conquest. It's calmer now, wiser. Cargo ships glide past fishing boats, their engines murmuring like distant drums. Somewhere beyond that horizon are lands that once bore Portugal's banner, now independent, proud, singing their own songs. In Luanda, a teacher quotes a Portuguese proverb to her students. Quem não tem mar navega em sonhos. Those without the sea sail in dreams. Her students smile, because even without empire, the current of history still carries them. In Lisbon, a poet writes in reply, "We built ships to escape ourselves and found ourselves waiting on the shore." The conversation continues across time, across continent. And maybe that's the point. Empire was about control, but memory is about dialogue. The two sides of that story, colonizer and colonized, are finally speaking, not in war, but in words. You stand one last time by the monument to the discoveries. The river glows silver in the dusk. The statues cast long shadows stretching inland, as if the explorers are returning home at last. Children play at their feet, oblivious to the weight of marble above them. Their laughter rings out over the water, light and unburdened. For the first time in centuries, Portugal doesn't look outward with hunger or backward with regret. It simply looks around, content to exist within its own horizon. The empire is gone. The memory remains. And in that memory, something gentler survives. The courage to face history without flinching, and the grace to let it rest. The air is still. The centuries have exhaled. You stand on Lisbon's waterfront one last time, beneath the orange hush of evening, and realize the story has finally come full circle. The waves at your feet sound the same as they did when Henry the Navigator first watched his ships drift toward the unknown, but the silence that follows them feels different now. Less like ambition, more like peace. The empire is over. Not in violence, not even in denial, but in quiet acknowledgement. Portugal has learned, at last, that history is not something you own, it's something you carry. The 20th century began with a nation still pretending to rule the world, and ended with one learning how to live within it. That transformation wasn't gentle. Decades of war, repression, censorship, and loss. But in the wreckage came a strange redemption. From the ruins of Salazar's Estado Novo and the exhaustion of the colonial wars, a democracy emerged. Not a perfect one, no such thing exists, but one capable of looking itself in the mirror. You can almost see that reflection across time. 15th century sailors scanning horizons for gold. 20th century soldiers marching into jungles they didn't understand. 21st century children tracing those journeys on digital maps, not with pride alone, but with comprehension. 600 years of expansion reduced not to a triumph or tragedy, but to a lesson. And what a lesson it is. That domination burns itself out, that ideas travel farther than armies, that the truest empire is empathy. Portugal once believed the world could be mapped. Now it understands that no map can contain the human heart. The outlines of Angola, Mozambique, Brazil, Goa, once drawn in ink and decree, now live instead in memory, cuisine, and song. The same language that once imposed obedience now carries poems, love letters, and jokes across continents. You walk the narrow streets of Alfama, hearing that language, alive and changing. Cape Verdean vendors teasing each other in Creole Portuguese. Tourists reading Fernando Pessoa aloud beside graffiti quoting Amilcar Cabral. The empire's afterlife is not silence, it's dialogue. Even the monuments have softened. At Belém, the marble figures of explorers face the sea, but people climb them now, sit on their stone cloaks, take selfies. History has become approachable, almost tender. On the nearby square, a small plaque lists the names of enslaved Africans who once passed through this port. Tourists pause, read, nod. It's not enough, but it's a start. And in every April since 1974, carnations bloom again. Children tuck them behind their ears. Veterans pin them to their jackets. And for one day, the whole country feels lighter. The revolution that ended the wars has become a ritual of renewal. A reminder that freedom isn't a flag, but a habit, something tended every spring. Outside Portugal, the Lusophone world continues to evolve. Brazil rises and falters in cycles of ambition. Angola and Mozambique rebuild with oil, music, and resilience. Cape Verde thrives on culture and diaspora. East Timor, once forgotten, finds its footing. The sea between them all is no longer empire's highway. It's a meeting place. You picture a ship today, not a caravel, but a cargo vessel carrying oranges, phones, and books between Luanda and Lisbon. Its hull is steel, its crew multinational, its wake the color of pewter. When it docks, no one salutes, no one conquers. They simply unload. Trade, not triumph. Connection, not control. That's the quiet miracle of history. Every conquest eventually becomes a conversation. Historians still debate when the empire truly ended. 1975, the Carnation Revolution, the last colony's independence, or perhaps it ends only when its descendants stop fighting over what it meant. Maybe it never fully ends. Maybe it just transforms, dissolving from geography into identity, and that's all right. Not all ghosts need banishment. Some deserve understanding. You tilt your head toward the horizon. The sky above the Tagus fades to silver, the same color sailors once mistook for the edge of the world. Somewhere out there, in Angola's hills or Mozambique's coasts, the descendants of those sailors live alongside the descendants of those they once ruled. They speak the same words, dream the same dreams, and disagree about the same past. That too is history's grace. It keeps us arguing together instead of apart. The story of Portugal's empire ends not with fireworks or monuments, but with a whisper, a lullaby carried on the tide. We endured, we learned, we changed. Now the sea returns to its rhythm, steady and endless. The empire has fallen asleep, but the nation remains awake. And you, still listening, can finally close your eyes, knowing that this long voyage, like all voyages, was never about the world Portugal found, but the world it had to find within itself. So now, as the tide slows and the lamps along the river flicker to life, let the noise of history settle into quiet ripples. You've traveled across 6 centuries tonight, from caravels slicing into uncharted seas to carnations blooming in rifle barrels. You've watched kingdoms rise, colonies fall, and ordinary people endure what kings and ministers could not. Let that weight lift from your shoulders for a moment. Empires are loud things, but their lessons are whispered. Listen, it's not conquest that survives, but connection. Not authority, but empathy. The same ocean that once divided lives now links them, carrying voices, stories, and the soft rhythm of forgiveness. Imagine the ships long gone, their sails folded forever. Imagine Lisbon at dawn, the cobblestones damp, the gulls circling above the bridge, the smell of coffee drifting from the quay. The past still breathes here, but gently, no longer demanding. If you look closely, you'll see the carnations again, bright, defiant, ordinary flowers. They're reminders that even the hardest histories can end in color. So breathe in deeply. Let the salt of the Atlantic settle in your lungs, the echo of centuries ebb away. The empire is over, yes, but its end left room for something quieter and far more durable, understanding. Now, close your eyes, traveler of time. The sea keeps its rhythm for you, steady as a heartbeat. Rest in that sound, the same one that carried sailors toward glory, soldiers toward loss, and a people, finally, toward peace. Sleep well. History will wait until morning.